the next presenter for today is Florea. He's a researcher at the Indiana Geological Survey, uh, Indiana Geological and Water Survey, sorry. I always mix it because I work with a lot of geologic surveys, so it's automatically like geologic survey and the country.
Yeah, thank you, Artur. And just so you know, water was only added to our name in 2017. So we even confused that ourselves, and it's an adjustment. But we are a research institute that does work across Indiana, and as a result, we try to incorporate as much as we can about Earth's surface, Earth materials, and water is certainly a major part of what we do. Let me share my screen if I can find that. And one moment here. Okay, go back to Zoom, share my screen. And I'm not finding it. There we go. Okay, got it. So I have a couple of things that I'd like today. Broadly, I'm going to just say up front that this is sort of on the other end of the thermal spectrum than what we just listened, but a lot of the same kinds of ideas and topics come through. And I will actually mention some stable isotopic work that we've done, but it's far less in terms of the number of samples and the scope. And some of that is location. Some of that is also sort of direction of effort. But I hope to give you a couple of leading comments in there about what we think some of the ideas for the future could be in sampling. And the sort of next piece of that I also very much want to emphasize that this is a ongoing series of research projects by a large number of people involved from an international team. And while much of what's been done at Rainier is concluded, partly because of permitting issues, ongoing work is happening 50 miles away at Mount St. Helens, which is very similar. And there are people on this Zoom meeting who are involved in that and can certainly answer some questions. Second sort of introductory note is to just mention that while time is somewhat limited today, there are other sources where you can listen to and learn some about what's going on. For example, In Situ just released 2 podcasts which have some of this research and also other research that is in my portfolio, just talking about what we're doing. And interestingly enough, and this is a bit of sort of a reflection on what Sherban just talked about, and then looking towards what I'll have in here, is that the idea of the effects of sulfur and the interaction and systematics between sulfur and carbon in karst is in some ways broadly understudied and applied in very select circumstances, but we're seeing more and more that there is overlap between sort of the end members of Movile Cave and Mammoth Cave, right, as sort of the other side of these sorts of end members in terms of the relationship of sulfur. And let me just show you one example. This is from Southern Kentucky, and I just threw this in here like 30 seconds ago, just as sort of a connection here. This is from Southern Kentucky on the Cumberland Plateau. And we have been working, and it's a group of cavers and scientists have been working in a cave that is quite vertical and quite extensive, and mapping it out on the flank of an anticline in these relatively horizontal Mississippian aged carbonates. And one of the things, and I just threw this photo in there, is in the mapping of the cave, the lowest levels, we discovered that there is raw crude oil product rising up through what we've identified as a fault plane. And this is oil filling a footstep from a few weeks earlier. And associated with that are large plumes of hydrogen sulfide and microbial mats. And this is in a cave that would otherwise ordinarily be called epigenetic and just surficial flow system. But here also we see that sulfur has some influence. So I wanted to throw that in as sort of a neat connection and show that what Sherban was talking about is a global phenomenon. And we have studied some key sites, but broadly, when you look closely, you'll find things. So let me just jump from that and take us back to the original goal here of this presentation, which is to discuss the work being done at Mount Rainier and more broadly the Cascade Volcanic Arc in the Pacific Northwest of the United States and Southwest Canada. And so, as if you're not aware, this is a convergence zone where the Juan de Fuca plate is being subducted below the North American plate at the Cascadia Trench. And this subducting slab, as it descends into the mantle, melts. And as it melts, that magma rises. And from that, we get a fairly famous arc of volcanoes, of which Mount Rainier is one. But there are others of very, broad familiarity to this group, such as Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens. And in particular, Mount St. Helens has ongoing work that we were just talking about before we started these presentations. So Mount Rainier is 14,411 feet, making it among the higher mountains in the lower 48 states of the United States. The summit is very popular with mountain climbers. It is technical. I'll show a few photos of that. And at the top, the oxygen levels are diminished to the extent that it causes some challenges for people who are not trained in working in higher altitude environments. And the weather conditions are also quite extreme. A flank of Mount Rainier is mantled by glaciers, as you can see in the image, and the summit, there are twin craters, and both of those craters are filled with a plug of glacial ice. And so what we're going to talk about is the relationship between magmatic heat that is rising through the volcanic edifice, how that interacts with the rock and the ice and the air that is broadly in the summit, but also we see along the flanks and thermal springs at the base of the edifice. So for the first part of the talk, I want to focus in on the Fumarole-ice caves in the summit crater, in both summit craters, but more broadly in the eastern crater, which has more than 3 kilometers of cave that is mapped. And when I first engaged in this project in 2015, I had seen a few photos of this and was really impressed. But even these photos don't really give you the true perspective and scope of what's there. It is an impressive cave. Very large conduits through the glacial ice along the contact between the overlying glacial plug and the crater slope, as you see in this image. And the glacial ice does move. We've confirmed that it moves quite a bit each year, but the cave seems to be broadly stable over decades, although the exact shape and position of entrances and size and morphology of passages changes a bit through time. So it is broadly in a dynamic equilibrium, and because that, it offers a great location to study a suite of different topics that are all associated with this hydrothermal system on Mount Rainier, from microbiology, of which we've not done that much, the cave morphology and geometry through surveying and multi-year profiles of passages, the cave climate, which is the first part of what I'll talk a bit about. And then the second is the geochemical makeup of the fumaroles and water within the caves, which is a bit on the second part of what I'll talk about. So as I mentioned, getting to the top of Mount Rainier does present challenges. And while the full scope of that is beyond the talk today, bear in mind that, as I said, this is a multinational effort of scientists, and it requires a large team of porters to help shuttle equipment up to the summit and back down from the summit. And that requires a tremendous logistical effort that Eddie Cartaya, who is broadly the project leader for Glacier Cave Explorers, has done yeoman's effort getting these teams and trips organized each year. And so climbing up Rainier often requires carrying very heavy backpacks, about 60 to 80 pounds of gear, scientific gear, food, tents, all of the supplies and waste and fuel up and down the mountain, and is a big part of the effort. It is technical, so it does require mountaineering skills to get to the top. And as I mentioned, when you approach the summit, the oxygen demands on the body can become pretty strong, and it can result in altitude sickness for some. So just to jump to one of the key features that I'll spend the next bit of time talking about, this is Lake Adeli, which is, as we know now, it's a glacial melt lake. And we thought maybe we would see some element of volcanic gas interacting with this lake. But what we discovered is that it is cold, it is effectively freezing and does freeze over. The specific conductivity is exceptionally low, and the pH is slightly acidic, so it reflects largely melted ice, a meteoric rainfall or snowfall that's collecting in this low point in the cave. The dissolved inorganic carbon is quite low, and its stable isotopic values suggest that it's broadly atmospheric CO2 with maybe just a little bit of volcanic gas mixed in from the fumaroles, and that's about it. Beyond that, there's really not that much special about this lake, which was surprising and a little disappointing. On the other hand, what I want to show you next is really cool, and it's a year's worth of data that we collected from this lake about temperature, water level, and specific conductance that really help us understand the dynamics of what's going on with the cave climate. And then later, I want to show you some geochemical samples that we collected and some of the things that might mean about the broad movement of water and heat through the Mount Rainier edifice. So first, let's just talk a bit about where we did the work and what the cave looks like. This is the East Crater, and this map that Christian Stenner, who's on the call today, provided to me, shows about 3.5 kilometers of cave passage. And in here, you'll see little dots that give you the location of where we had monitoring equipment located. And those include cave temperature and pressure, water temperature, water level, which is pressure, and a specific conductance, which broadly was 0, so that is not considered henceforth. And then the location of 3 fumaroles where Andreas Fisch had temperature monitors through time to look at what those fumarole temperatures, how they changed over the course of several years. So I want to focus in on this graph for a few moments. There is a lot of data here. A publication in Journal of Geophysical Research, Atmospheres, just came out, which basically takes this graph and deconstructs it into its parts and talks about what within that helps us understand the connection between the outside air, the cave air, and the water level and temperature in Lake Adeli. And so what I really want to focus on is showing you the water level data. And this is really quite cool what we detected. So this was through using an in situ Aquatrol 200, which we put in the water, and we left for a year, and I thought that we would not get it back. But magically, somehow, after a year and a whole bunch of things happening, we did get this back, and it was not damaged. And it required the use of a selfie stick and a GoPro to find it in between rocks, and then use that selfie stick with a couple of other things to kind of shimmy it out and pull it back out, thread it out between boulders that had slipped down and covered it over the course of a year. And so the water level shown in gray is what 1 year's worth of data for water level looked like. And at first it looked at it and I didn't know quite what to make of it. The water level's going up, the water level's going down. But broadly, we knew that the water level had gone up because it was up with respect to the previous year, and we knew that. We could see that. And so what was creating this up and down was a bit confusing at first, till we realized that the anchor, which was roughly a room-sized boulder that we attached it to, was not stable. In fact, nothing in that cave is stable. And that boulder, along with everything else, is moving slowly because of freeze-thaw cycles and because of the lubrication of that slope material with meltwaters. And so we have periods of time where that boulder was shifting slightly down, and periods of time where that boulder was rotating. And that shift and rotating was creating ups and downs of the data that we could track with thresholding on what the rate of change is. And we see periods of time where we have water level going up normally, and then the water level drops dramatically because we have the boulder rotating, pulling it back up out of the water, such that there were even periods of time where the instrument was pulled completely up out of the water. And so if we deconstruct this and recreate a curve, we create this black curve, which is what we observed at the actual change in water level through time and what was happening to the instrument in terms of the water depth. That's really helps us understand the connection between what's going on with the instrument and periods of time where we have increased melt, such as shown here in this reddish pink color. And then periods where we have major changes that are rotated with freeze-thaw cycles that follow these increased periods of melt. And so the connection between that and what's going on outside was really of interest. And so I'm going to skip through a little bit of this and just tell you that again, the deconstruction of this time series is in this publication, and you can look that up and read about it. But what we used correlation analysis, as you see in this correlation table, where we have autocorrelograms of the data to itself, and then cross correlograms of that data to each of the other variables that we measured. And you see that the correlation changes with respect to time, in this case, what we call lags, which are hourly data, such that you have periods of high correlation between data and periods of low correlation between data, which speak to periodicities of what's happening, and also cause and effect structures such that one cause precedes the effect by X number of time units. So we can look at how long it takes a change in cave temperature and pressure to translate to changes in water level. And so that's what this correlogram is one indication of, as well as the strength of that correlation. And then the second aspect of that is looking at the data as a wavelet, which is basically understanding that same correlation, that periodicity, but now through using wave packets and trying to deconstruct what the scope and size of those types of signals are within the data. And so I'll just pick this one labeled B, and these are for with respect to each of the fumaroles. And these areas that are yellowish in color are areas within the data set of high correlation with each other. So the in this data, we see high correlation at these normalized frequencies, which is basically a seasonal signal. So, on the order of 6 months to a year, we see a repeating sort of pattern. And then the same here at this other area, which is about 40 to 60 days. And then this zone up in here, which is roughly synoptic scale, or the passage of frontal systems every 7 to 10 days through the system. And so we see those propagate into the cave as changes in fumarole temperature and also changes in cave temperature and water level, which is really cool because what we can come up with is a model for how this cave responds to changes in thermal flux from the volcanic heat, and also from meteoric changes from the passage of synoptic scale systems and broader interannual changes in climate. And what we see is that when we have a major storm event in the wintertime, that snow accumulates and seals off the cave and then does not allow the broad advection of the heat out of the cave and creates a circulation cell of increased melt, which then percolates into the substratum and then moves back out of that substratum as increased fumarole flux. And so that sort of pressure cooker, if you will, then melts out those entrances and then allows advection of that heat back out. And we see that sort of on a multi-time per winter cycle of entrance sealing, increased melt and water level of the lake, increased slope movement, and then opening of the entrance and then flushing that back out with the increased flow of outside air through the system. And so that dynamic equilibrium maintains the broad shape and location of the cave passages, but allows for growth and shrinking as a result of accumulation and ablation of snow on the summit, which is really kind of cool. So I'm going to shift now for a next few minutes after talking about sort of what we discovered with fumaroles and the temperatures and the effect on the cave and how then that translates into mass wasting and water level in the cave lake. And then shift now into understanding a little bit about the geochemistry. And for this, we had a little bit of information in the summit, but we also collected samples from 3 areas of thermal heat on the flanks of the volcano. And one of those is Winthrop, which is the terminal outflow for one of the glaciers. We had Longmire Hot Springs and Paradise Warm Springs. We did not sample from Ohanapakash Hot Springs, which is further to the south and east. So those are 3 sets of data that I'll show you. One, and I will not spend much time on this, is looking at the isotopic profile of the drip waters, the lake waters, the ice, and the fumaroles, and trying to understand the broad relationships among them. And without getting into much detail here, because we still have some analysis to work on, what we've seen is a broad shift in the isotopic profile of the fumaroles as there has been long-term cooling by a few degrees over time. And that shift in isotopic profile of the fumaroles is then projecting out to where we see the actual lake and drip waters that we're collecting from the cave and from the lake, Lake Adeli in the cave. And those are sort of a homogenized set of data from the overlying ice and from the fumaroles that are contributing to moisture in the cave air. And then on the lower slopes, we have our thermal springs and our in glacial streams and our snowfall that we see. So that's the water isotope. But more interesting to me is the actual water chemistry that we find. And so what I have on these two graphs are clusters of data. And by data clusters, we're talking about only a few samples at present. But they do sort of break out into categories. The first of which I have labeled is Lake Adeli. And that's the blue circle on the Piper diagram, which combines our major anions, negatively charged anions or ions, and cations, the positively charged ions, and projects them up to show where that data lie on this diamond plot in the middle. And so Lake Adeli is shown here, which if we look over on the water chemistry of sodium to chlorine ratio and sodium to calcium ratio, pops out about here, which is roughly what we expect in terms of sodium chloride ratio to be related to aerosols of sea salt that are then propagating up off of the Pacific Ocean, even here at altitude, to be incorporated within the water. The concentrations are quite low. But even with those low concentrations, the ratio of them is broadly sea salt. But the broad chemistry of those is very much what we would find in precipitation. As we move into the Winthrop outflow, which is an inglacial stream, we see that that has more of a signal that would be related to the weathering, the chemical weathering of the edifice material, the volcanic rocks. On the other side, Longmire Hot Springs, which is at the base of the volcanic edifice, has a signal that's more related to marine sediments. And so we have this sort of dichotomy between waters that are being sort of circulated through and affected by the volcanic system, and those that may be warm or hot, but are moving through earlier marine sediments and marine rocks that upon which the volcanic edifice was placed several 100,000 years ago. And so this sort of difference between the two we can see very clearly in these data. And then Paradise Warm Springs, which is on the flank of the edifice, is sort of between these two end members, but has a concentration of sodium chloride, a ratio of those two, which is much more akin to aerosol. And we'll see in the next few slides a bit why some of that's the case. So now we have carbon isotopes and sulfur isotopes, which gets back to some of the concept that Sherban talked about. We're not looking at biology here, but some of these same kinds of processes apply. First, let me point out that even though the concentration of inorganic carbon is very low in Lake Adeli, its isotopic ratios are very similar to what we would find in the atmosphere, with a little bit of depletion of that added by what we see coming out of the fumaroles. So this is our broad lake signature. The springs on the flank and the inglacial streams are very different from this. And so we can again sort of ascribe zones here. Our atmospheric signal with carbon around Lake Adeli. The Winthrop Glacial outflow is in that same range, but a little bit more enhanced because it has a little bit more of a sedimentary signal. And we see that as we go to Paradise Warm Springs and Longmire Hot Springs, we see more of a isotopic profile of carbon that is more like the marine sediments upon which the volcanic edifice is placed. And the sulfur isotopes go from more of a volcanic signal, as we see on the volcanic edifice, over to more of that marine sediment signature, which in Longmire Hot Springs at the base of the volcano. If we go over to the fumarole itself, we see that that's a volcanic signature very clearly. It has high sulfide concentrations, and that the sulfur isotopes are volcanic in nature, and the carbon isotopes are depleted, as we would see from methanogenesis, from heating of that gas. So now I want to show what is a bit of a confusing graph, and of which we need more data, but it's harder to get these data. And these are of chlorine and iodine isotopes, which help us understand more of an age relationship or a residence time. And so I'm just going to put these on here. Again, this is with relationship to sulfur isotopes, which again has the volcanic versus sedimentary axis here. But with respect to chlorine isotopes, our Paradise warm springs and our Winthrop outflow has chlorine isotopes which are elevated, which are more related to meteoric rainfall and what we would see in young water. Whereas the data from Longmire hot springs are nearly dead with respect to chlorine 36, which means that they're quite old. And that makes sense for a subducted slab conveying marine sediments and old waters into the mantle and then those moving up. In contrast, we see the iodide isotopes showing a very different story. And this is where it gets a bit confusing because we can explain this quite easily at Paradise Warm Springs as being a iodine depleted signature from very young waters that are circulating only within the edifice. And because they're young, they don't have that signature of iodine 129, which would come from, in this case, perhaps the Hanford site, where a large iodine 129 plume was released decades ago. And so that illustrates young waters that are high in chlorine and very depleted in iodine isotopes. But when we get to Longmire hot springs, we see very elevated waters or elevated iodine 129 in these waters, which could mean that these waters, in addition to have some fraction, which is very old from the subducted slab, have some small fraction, which is very enriched in iodine because of atmospheric deposition of iodine 129 from the Hanford site and that iodine release that happened decades ago. So somewhat older waters mixing with very old waters, and then on the edifice itself, quite young waters from localized circulation. And this matches helium isotopes that were done by Zimbelman in the late 90s and early 2000s, which showed that most of the gas in the fumaroles and in the summit and most of the water flow is very localized convection and localized migration. And that the thermal gas, volcanic gases are not that intense except at a few locations. And that's unlike what we see like at Mount St. Helens and out and other locations where you see actual high concentrations of CO2 and H2S and SO2 as a result of much higher contributions of volcanic gas. So that's really basically what I wanted to show you is a bit of a summary of what we've been doing. As I said, there are a few people on this call that can talk more about the process of the expeditions or what's going on at St. Helens, but I want to end it there and give you a chance for any questions you might have or to have whatever discussion that might come from that. So thank you very much for your time this morning in the Eastern US, moving into the afternoon. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. So if there are any questions or comments?
I was going to say, and Christian, if you want just one moment here. There, now we have matching backgrounds.
Any comments or questions? Feel free. So
thanks, everybody. Yeah, go ahead, Artur.
Siobhan, you wanted to?
Yeah, at some point. Go ahead, Artur.
No, go. You're the invited one.
Okay. Yeah. No, really interesting. It's pretty amazing what you guys are doing. I'm looking forward to being in touch with you and talking more about these places. I think there's a lot of potential, especially in places where hydrogen sulfide and methane is present, to look for some creatures that are alive and use these. So yeah, great talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Absolutely. That's among the things to do next in this southern Kentucky area, is to get a bioinventory of that site, because we see little white things swimming around, but they're not in my portfolio of stuff that I study. And so I know that they could be endemic, because they often are, but you know, that's not my field.
Yeah. The interesting thing, of course, the fauna in caves in that part of the world was studied and studied and studied. So I don't think there is a lot of potential of finding new species, endemic or unusual species. What would be interesting to see is if indeed they rely on food that has to do with the presence of what you found there, the hydrocarbons. So that is the question to answer. Yeah.
So I would have a question, Lee.
Yes.
Mount Rainier. Maybe I didn't were paying attention. So you measure the carbon-13 from the CO2 or from the methane component from the fumarole?
CO2.
Yes.
And so you only saw one dot there.
Yeah.
And that is that high noon fumarole. And I think, Christian, you know that one. That one's up on the north side near the Yeti entrance, I believe, right? And that is the only fumarole that I remember in the East Crater that we got significant hits on for H2S. And by significant, I mean measurable on the gas monitor we were using. There on the West Crater, we saw a lot more H2S broadly and more CO2 broadly. And I know, Christian, there were a couple of rooms where there was high CO2 in the East Crater, kind of in the lower areas. But of the fumaroles, that's the only one I remember that really had a significant hit on H2S. And that's also closer to that Columbia crest and over in the West Crater where you see more of that. When we measured the sample, when we collected the samples and the USGS gave us sample containers to do that, that was the only one that came back as non-contaminated. And for them, contaminated meant air. And what that tells me is exactly what Zimbelman discovered, is that we didn't sample them wrong. We just got air, because most of the fumarole gas is just recycled air, except in that high noon fumarole. Christian, does that match your memory of some of that? Okay. So I think there's opportunity to measure more there, but the sampling methodologies that we used required these fancy evacuated glass chambers with like these stopcock turn thing, and the chance of breaking one of those, which apparently they don't make anymore, was exceptionally high. And they gave us 4 of them, and we promised we would bring them down unbroken, and we did, but I felt very nervous the entire time carrying those around.
Yeah, so there are different ways. With Tobias Fisher from New Mexico, we had a talk about how, because he was in Mount Erebus, so it's famous for ice chimneys and this kind. There's a specific way to sample them, and you don't need the fancy glassware that can be broken. You use copper tubes. You can smash them, you can throw them, they have no problem. However, the sampling methodology is a bit different. So I think there's more to be done in these areas, more sampling.
I think that would be great. We did look into the copper tube with the crimping,
Yeah.
but that was for helium. And we never got to do the helium because of expense and timing of laboratories. But since the USGS was going to do it for free, they wanted us to use their sample containers, which date it from the 1980s.
Yeah. So just with the sampling, when I was in Ecuador in a gas workshop, the first 3-4 days is like, okay, everybody presents what he did in the last 3 years and so on. Then we go on the site for different selected, or some volcanoes for with Fumarole commission or hot springs. So what happens in this we make the sampling line, which you know how it looks, or with titanium tubes or with other stuff. And then comes, okay, I want to sample in my really fancy glass flask, pre-evacuated everything. Okay, I want to sample in the copper tube. Everybody has his own sampling methodology. That's inside or internal sampling method. Okay, I don't like to use a glass freeway valve. I like to use a Teflon one. So it's always good to use these different sampling methods and then to compare the results, because some are good for some cases, some are good in other cases. For example, in thermal springs, you don't use the sampling methodology that you use for a fumarole. And for ice case or glacial volcanic case, it's important to use a different approach compared to the others, which is not widely known how to do it.
Absolutely. You
So,
are
so
correct.
I think this communication between volcanologists, geochemists, and glacial explorers must be tighter.
We so when I say we, my research group, sampling in low temperature cave streams for DIC and carbon isotopes, we had a protocol for doing that, and it's pretty straightforward and simple. Taking that same protocol to thermal streams, I discovered very quickly that even just the simple like sampling methodology caused mass precipitation of oxyhydroxides in the sampling container. And while we didn't think there was carbon in it, we couldn't be assured that some of the carbon did not dump out in those precipitates and shift our isotopic profile. And so, you, as you say, you have to adapt to whatever your sort of sampling system is to the kinds of conditions on the ground. And of course, what we were doing in Rainier was what they would do in, let's say, St. Helens, where you actually have very clear warm to hot fumaroles that have lots of volcanic gas because it's an active volcano, right? As opposed to Rainier, which is an active volcano that really is more dormant and it has very low flux of actual volcanic gas. So the systematics of how we did our sampling actually probably don't catch that volcanic gas the way we should to be able to measure it.
Yeah. So what's the conclusion? We need to go back.
Well, and that's actually the thing, is that when you are working at 14,000 feet, and let's leave out the U.S. Park Service from this answer, which is its own thing, but even that, as a Christian, you know very well, getting anything up there has about a 50% success rate of actually collecting information from it, just by sheer fact of the challenges of getting up and down and your brain just not working at 100% when you're there on site trying to do science. It is easier, perhaps, at St. Helens when you're at half of the altitude or less, and you have a helicopter flying you in.
Yeah.
Just saying. I'm kind of bitter about that.
I have another question about the Rainier caves.
Sure.
So you said that the amount of volcanic gas of real volcanic gas is pretty small. So what causes the immense volcanic alteration or the rock alteration?
Oh, so I think let me sort of rephrase that in a more exact way for you so that I'm not mischaracterizing. So the sort of hydrothermal alteration of the edifice rock is a major issue, right? It's like one of the biggest contributors to mass wasting of the volcano. And some of the research ongoing by Claire Todd, for example, at Pacific Lutheran is looking at chlorine and sulfur and a few other dissolved ions in outflows and how they change as a signature of changing rates of hydrothermal alteration underneath the glacial mantle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's happening. And we know it's happening. And that's pretty cool because what they're trying to do is get a predictive model of when you see spikes in sulfate or chlorine, does that mean that you're about ready to have an outburst flood because of, you know, some clogging of the system and then it's coming out.
Mm-hmm.
On Rainier, there are areas in which that's focused. And so those areas in which that's focused have been broadly mapped out using like remote sensing of heat flux and actually mapping out where fumaroles are. And it seems as though there's like some key areas which are almost like linear features where the heat flux is happening more. But as a whole, the edifice is less active, right, than like St. Helens would be. But some of those places where we could do the sampling in theory are not very accessible. Like I think one of the areas that is significant with significant flux is over like near Little Tahoma Peak, and you see lots of alteration going on. But getting over there is not nearly like as straightforward. Or and I know when we climb up, there's this place that is on the way to, let me get this right. Yeah, it's on the way up when you start going past the Ingram Flats, and before you go up the Cleaver, we kind of go around this sort of glacial bend, and there's a bunch of seracs, and you can actually see heat rising sometimes and see some staining on the ice. And I think there is known fumarole activity happening there as well as on the Cleaver because you can see some like hot rocks and stuff. But getting down in those serac falls to capture whatever fumarole gas there is probably not the safest of options. And I think as a result, quite a bit of where this might be happening has been unsampled.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Cool. Thanks. So without it degrading into a St. Helens conversation, because, you know, that can happen since, you know, I just was on a call about it and two people who are going in June are on the call here. Maybe you actually even Artur, although you're not quite worked out yet, right? You're planning on it.
No, I'm going.
You are going. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Linda also.
That's great.
So,
I know Andreas said, and this is all pandemic stuff, you know, if this happens, then this happens, and then it happens. And we're all in that world of like, can we or can we not travel? But, you know, there is the things that we're talking about with respect to Rainier are certainly a lot of the same questions at St. Helens, but amplified, right? And at a much more accelerated pace just by the nature of the heat flux that's there. So I'd be really, really interested outside of this call and over the next month or so to find out what actually would be the best in terms of sampling targets to look at more depth at some of these questions that are harder to answer at Rainier because of altitude, logistics, and politics.
yes, so Linda is going. So if everything goes okay and we don't need some special permit center, and also I will join. And also Tobias Fischer, who is a remarkable volcanologist, geochemist, will join us. from New Mexico. So there
That's fantastic.
will be a good gas team there.
Fantastic.
And we already have some ideas what we can do and what we can accomplish there.
And on my side, Christian, you heard a little bit on this on the call, is maybe I can come, I'll know soon. But I have a colleague that's working with me who is a carbon sulfur systematics, like geochemostable isotope person, who is very interested in doing it. Also is exceptionally good at vertical and cave survey, which is helpful.
Yeah. Great. So if there are any other questions for Lee or for Sherban, or some comments?
Thank you very much, Artur, for the opportunity here. I appreciate it. And I look forward to some collaborations. And Sherban, let's talk, because I got some interesting sites and data that I can share that might be of interest to you.
Okay, thanks, Lee. So for the guys who are with us each week, see you next week with the 6th edition of the webinar series.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Have a great afternoon.
Night or
night
morning or
or
wherever you're at. So, thanks.